What makes a record truly rare? Is it simply supply and demand based on the number of copies pressed? Is it the year it was released? Certain genres? Certain eras? We will discuss on this episode talking about records. My name is G.I. Sanders from NTX Vinyl, a small chain of independent record shops in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. If you're not local, but you are in the U.S., you can shop with us anytime at ntxvinyl.com. And of course, would love it if you'd subscribe to our channel here on YouTube and follow us across social media on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at NTX Vinyl is the handle. Let's talk about rarity. This is a really interesting topic, and like a lot of my videos, I scratched this one down on my list because someone asked me a question, and they asked me a question actually why I was selling a record. They said, is this a rare record? And my answer, I kind of paused and I thought, well, I don't know. Is it rare to you? Because the first thing I think of when I get asked the question about rarity is perspective, right? What's rare to me or what's rare to you may not be rare to another individual. So that's the first thing to understand is if you just started collecting, maybe, a couple months, a couple years ago, well, things seem a lot rarer because you simply haven't seen as many records. On the flip side, if you've owned a record store for 30 years, well, you've seen your fair share of records. So you have a much clearer perspective and probably more concise perspective about what is actually rare versus common, right? So that's really the biggest answer here is most of rarity depends on your perspective and your context, right? So put that aside though. Let's pretend it's more of an even playing field and let's talk about rarity. Most people consider rarity or when rarity is considered, it has to do with numbers, right? So you're talking about the number of something that exists. If there's only 10 of something in the world and there's no number 11, well, that's probably a lot more rare than something that has been, manufactured thousands or millions of times, right? That's pretty much common sense will tell you that. As it pertains to records, yes, number pressed certainly is an indicator of rarity. Now that could be something that's new being pressed and a record label or an artist is purposefully limiting the number. Maybe it's limited to 1,000 copies, right? And maybe it's a specific version. So there's certainly rarity to take into consideration on limited pressings. But even pressings that weren't necessarily limited, maybe you go back to, the 90s or the early 2000s when, records were not getting pressed that much at all simply because there wasn't a lot of demand for vinyl because everyone was buying CDs or loading up digital music on their iPods or whatever. So again, not limited pressing by number, but limited pressing simply because of supply and demand. That's the other big thing at play here. If an artist, let's say a very undiscovered independent artist presses an album and they press 1,000 copies and they're hand numbered out of 1,000, well, that would seem to be pretty rare. There's only 1,000 in existence. But who's the artist? Like, do they have an audience? Have they performed? Have they put out other records? Do they have the ability to get in front of people to sell those records? So 1,000 may be too many. It may not be rare at all, Same could be said for 100 records. If you're completely new to this and you're an artist and you're just getting your feet off the ground, maybe 100 records is the right amount for you to press, right? So it may seem very, very limited, but it all depends on the market. It's supply demand based on the market. And then the flip side is some artists will put out an album and maybe they'll press 10,000. Maybe that's not near enough and that becomes a really rare record, so 100 versus 10,000 doesn't equate. But when you take into consideration the market and the supply and demand, those have a big, big impact. So if you're trying to figure out if a record is rare, there are a lot of factors. One, it's your perspective. Two, it's how many exist versus how many people want them, right? That's, again, simple supply and demand, not limited to the record market or the vinyl market, more so any hobbyist or collector market or any manufactured good that's of some limited quantity, right? So perspective, number press, supply and demand, those are all kind of the most obvious things. Some of the less obvious things I think have to do with geography. So certain artists or genres or styles of music are certainly more prevalent in areas of the country or areas of the world than others. So that can have an impact on rarity. I know, me being in Dallas, Texas, I see a ton of country records. I see a ton of Willie Nelson records, Waylon Jennings records. I see a ton of Texas country stuff, Townes Van Zandt and Guy Clark and things like that. Not as rare here, but I suspect in other areas of the United States or other areas of the world that stuff is much more rare. So it just depends on where you're at based on where the record label distributed their albums the most. Now, common sense tells you that, Willie Nelson, he's put out, I think, over 100 studio albums. So certainly his catalog is not rare because there's tons of those. But you got to figure a lot of those are distributed and picked up by record stores in an area that is very familiar with his music and contains a lot of fans of his music. So I see them much more frequently than, say, like Chicago blues. Like, I don't see a lot of blues. Every now and then I'll see some, but I guarantee you, go up to the Midwest, go up to the Northeast, you see a lot more blues. You might see a lot more kind of punk coming out of the Northeast. Sorry. And so, again, geography can have a play, especially when you get into international, because then you get into, artists that are mainly more US based versus more UK based, or maybe they were big in Ireland and they're not as big here. You can name any country for that matter. So certainly geography plays a big part in rarity, based on where you're at and based on if you're trying to acquire a record that wasn't even released in your country, right? So that's a big part of it. Certainly the era when it came out has something to do with rarity, how old it is. Something's pressed in the 40s or the 50s or the 60s, 50 years later, how easy is it to find that record? In some cases, very easy, because millions were pressed. In other cases, the number's not known, but I can tell you, after seeing many tens of thousands of records over the course of a couple of years owning a record store, that you can tell when you see a record and you've never seen it before, you're like, I don't know how valuable this is, but certainly rare to me. Again, that's the key, rare to me based on what I have seen. The other thing there is, does rarity always equate to value? Not always. I'll see records sometimes that I've never seen before, and I'll look them up, and they're readily available, and it's worth $5. I had never seen it before. It was completely rare to me, not valuable based on what the market dictates. That happens a lot, not only with records I see, but with people who contact me with records, because there's plenty of people who collected records 40, 50, 60 years ago, and they've had their little collection, or maybe it's a large collection, and those are all the records they've known. And when they bought those records, they had a certain perspective about, were those rare, were those common, and they've never seen any records since. So to them, they're all rarities. They're all obscure. They're all meaningful, and that's all reality. That's all true. But again, you have to pair that with what the market dictates and what is actually common in regards to people who deal with these things on a regular basis. So a lot of times rarity does equate to value, but there are many instances when it doesn't necessarily, again, because that rarity is more about your perspective of what you're used to seeing or what I'm used to seeing versus what the market actually dictates, right? The other big piece of this, and this is specific to vinyl for sure, records or physical media for that matter, but it goes across any hobby, anything where there is collector's mentality, right? The biggest thing I think that impacts rarity is condition. This is a big one, because there are plenty of albums that have had many thousands or even millions pressed to vinyl, right? If an album came out in pretty much from the 60s through the late 80s, there were a lot pressed of that album if it was a popular title, if it was a mainstream title, right? So those are everywhere. Now, can you find one that may be sealed? Can you find one that's in mint condition? That is when you really get into rarity, because most people played their albums. They were utilities. It was the only way to hear music in your home, other than, turning on the radio. And so LPs got played. Absolutely they did. So to find them in pristine condition or sealed, never opened, that is truly rare in most cases, or in a lot of cases. Again, not all cases. There are still records that will only sell for a few bucks, even though they came out in, the early 80s and they're sealed. They've never been opened. They're legitimately sealed, not resealed or anything like that. And they still will only sell for a few bucks because the artists just aren't that desirable. It wasn't one of their popular albums. Or again, there were just so many made that everyone had them in their collection, I get calls all the time, calls, inquiries, messages, as I'm sure every record store owner does. And there's three in particular that always come up, and it always makes you laugh, but I completely understand why. The first one's Michael Jackson Thriller. Like, I can't count on my fingers and toes the number of times I've got inquiries about Michael Jackson Thriller, because people will call me as a record store owner and they say, "Do you buy records?" I say, "Sure, I do. Tell me what you have." And they say, "Well, I've got a original copy of Michael Jackson Thriller." And I typically say, "That's really cool. You should hang on to it." Because I don't want to break it to them that basically they have a $10 record. And to them, again, they've held on to this thing for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, whatever it may be, whatever the record is. And so it's hard to kind of talk them off that ledge, because they think they're holding something that's worth thousands of dollars because it was Michael Jackson's Thriller. Keep in mind, one of the most popular records of all time, one of the biggest selling records of all time. What does that mean? It means many, many millions were pressed and still are being pressed, and everybody had them in their collection, right? So pretty much the poster child for common records would be Michael Jackson Thriller. The other two are the Beatles and Elvis. Now, don't get me wrong. There are plenty of Beatles and Elvis records, which are actually very rare and can be very valuable and collectible, right? And I love the Beatles, and I like Elvis too. But the reality is, most of the records, I would say 99% of the records that you see on a regular basis in a record store, in a collection, wherever it may be, are very, very common. And it's the same answer as Michael Jackson. The Beatles and Elvis, they're the most iconic, most popular, and most pressed artist out of all of them in the world. So yes, they are iconic, but that does not mean that their albums are rare in most cases. Again, there are outliers, absolutely. I own some in my collection. If you can find the very early Elvis records, again, in good condition, those are beauties. Same with Beatles. There are versions, especially if you get into UK pressings, like the White Album, Top Loader UK. That's a very rare album and hard to find because it's very sought after by collectors. So again, supply and demand based on what's available. So it's always entertaining when I get those calls, and I hate to break it to people, but the reality is if you've got a normal collection of Elvis records that you've been holding on to for 40, 50, 60 years, chances are those records are worth a couple dollars a piece, even in great condition, just because there were so many of them, right? So rarity is tricky. It's definitely tricky for people who are just now entering the hobby. And when I say that, I mean, over the last couple of years, because there is a lot of new collectors. And there's definitely, again, back to perspective, there's a lot of newer collectors who are just getting into this. And the reason why is because records are prevalent again and they're being pressed again, whether they're seeing them at Target or Walmart at big boxes, or whether they're going into the local record store and they're seeing new albums that are coming out right now being pressed on vinyl. And so because something's new and it's getting manufactured right now in pressing plants, it gives certain people, I think, a perspective that the older stuff, the vintage stuff, the stuff from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, like that stuff is extremely rare. In some cases it is. In most cases, it's not, simply because there were millions of them made. It's not like a niche that it is now. Again, 85, 90% of the music industry right now is streaming. Vinyl and physical media is 10, 12, 15% of the total market. And so it's very niche. And the fact that, an artist, even a pretty popular artist, will press many thousands of records, like that's, in the grand scheme of things, that's minuscule compared to what used to happen in the 60s, 70s, 80s, when vinyl was the preferred format for listening to music, right? And so it's context, it's perspective, and it's supply and demand. Those are really the three things at play. Also, again, geography, genre, some of those other kind of, I would say, secondary factors. But that's the answer, and it's not a short one. Most hard questions aren't a short one. So when that person asked me, I don't remember the record I was selling. I was holding up a record in a live auction setting, and they literally asked, was like, "Is that rare?" And I was like, I don't know how to answer that without going into this long spiel. And so I figured I'd dump my spiel here on talking about records, because that's what this is all about. So I would love to hear your perspective. Part of me wanted to go through my collection and pull out a bunch of records that I felt were rare. I've done some videos like that in the past. And it's fun to look at those. It really is. Again, and a lot of those are just going to be based on my perspective, because you may have them all in your collection, and to you, they're not rare. You know, it just really depends. But I remember when that person asked me that question, I think my answer was, I don't know. Is it rare to you? Because I was like, it wasn't a rare. I don't remember what the record was, but I remember kind of looking behind me and going, it's not a rare record to me, but that doesn't mean it won't be a rare record to you. And that's the truth of it. And so again, it kind of speaks to the idea of like why you're collecting records. If people are trying to collect based on rarity and based on, it being an investment, well, you really need to know your stuff then. You really need to know your stuff. And I've also been asked, like, well, how do you get good at this? How do you know what to choose? How do you know what, if you're thinking about it from an investment standpoint? And the reality is there's no shortcuts. You just have to deal with thousands and thousands and thousands of records over the course of many, many years, not 1 or 2 years. Like, sure, you could probably learn some stuff and get up to speed, but I've only been in the business side of this for 6, 7 years. Prior to that, I collected. I've been collecting since I was 15 years old. But the reality is there's record store owners who have been in this for their entire life, for as long as I've been alive. And I guarantee you they have way more perspective and way more context in regards to all this than me and anyone else, because they've simply dealt with the records longer. And that's what it's all about. It's about being hands-on, and that's the only way to learn this business. And it's the only way to learn it as a collector too. The longer you collect, the more knowledge you gain, the more perspective you gain, and you start to really understand what's rare. A lot of it comes down to condition. And I think it obviously, all of that time and experience, it helps you develop what type of collector you're going to be and what's meaningful for you and what you're going to choose to spend your money on and choose to take up shelf space with, because that's a big part of it. So there you go. That's my spiel on Rarity. I would love to hear your opinions. What's the rarest record in your collection? Tell me what it is, and I'll tell you from my perspective if it's a rare one. So thanks as always. This has been another episode of Talking About Records. My name is G.I. Sanders, and we'll see you again next time.